What do you put on your hot dog?
Ketchup.
What else? And mustard. Just ketchup? You're putting just ketchup on your hot dog?
Yeah.
Just ketchup.
Yeah.
No mustard.
Yeah.
Really? I come from a long line of hot dog lovers. Just saying. Are you pro ketchup on a hot dog or anti? Let us know in the comments. Hey everyone, I'm Claire Saffitz. Welcome to my home kitchen. Today I'm showing you a recipe for classic puff pastry. So previously on the show, we did rough puff, but today I'm doing it right. I'm gonna take my time and show you how to get the flakiest, tallest rising pastry.
And then are you gonna make a hot dog?
And then we're gonna do something really tasty with it. Previously, I've made what's called rough puff pastry, which is more like pie dough than traditional puff pastry. It's kind of a hybrid, and basically it has some large pieces of butter that flatten into sheets, and it kind of mimics that separation and layering that you get from puff pastry. But I'm making it the traditional way today. I'm showing you a technique called lamination. Basically, it's a process of flattening a big piece of butter into dough, folding it to multiply the number of layers, and then you get this really flaky, like super separation of layers. And then we're gonna use the puff pastry to make a delicious little snack. So ingredients for the dough, I have all-purpose flour. I scaled the recipe to then make the right amount of dough for 8 ounces of butter. This is like 473 grams of all-purpose flour, a half cup of milk, half cup of water, 10 grams salt, 3 tablespoons butter melted and cooled, about 2 teaspoons lemon juice, and 2 tablespoons granulated sugar. And for the butter block, I have 8 ounces or 2 sticks unsalted butter. I'm gonna start by mixing in the sugar and salt. The sugar is just there to add browning properties. So stuff with a little bit of sugar will turn nice golden brown in the oven. Then I'm gonna add my other wet ingredients. So typically you see water used in the dough for puff pastry, but I'm gonna do half water, half milk, because the milk tends to add a little bit of a tenderizing effect, which is nice. About a half cup of each. And the butter. So this dough does not have yeast in it. If I were to add yeast, I'd have something a lot closer to like a croissant dough. So the only kind of leavening or lift that this dough gets is from the butter itself and that lamination. There's no baking powder or anything like that. So I'm doing all of this by hand, and I'm gonna turn this out onto my work surface. You could throw this into a stand mixer with the hook and just mix on low speed until you have a nice smooth dough, but I'm gonna do it by hand. Obviously this is quite shaggy and there are lots of floury bits, but all I want is for the liquid to be incorporated, and then I'll further bring it together on the surface. I'm going to begin to sort of knead it and work it. Generally speaking, when you start to mix dough, like the flour takes a little bit of time to hydrate. It tends to look really dry in the beginning. And then once you work it a little bit, as the flour hydrates, it will feel much wetter. So what I want to do here is develop the gluten. We still want it to be supple and smooth. And the most important thing is, like, if it's too wet, then it's going to be hard to incorporate the butter. The butter might kind of squeeze out. If it's too dry, then you won't really be able to roll it out. So we're kind of going for this middle ground in terms of the texture. The flour that I'm using and I've been using has dried out a little bit, and so I have a feeling this dough is going to take a little extra moisture, so I'm going to grab a squeeze bottle of water. Make sure you really work the dough. Continue kneading until some of that surface texture goes away. It's pretty mottled looking and rough, and I just want that to smooth out. So this should go for probably, let's say, 5 more minutes of this kind of hand kneading, and a mixer probably will happen a little bit faster.
Why did you leave the flour out?
I didn't leave it out. It's that we've been storing flour in the basement as like in like a bulk bin. And I've just been noticing that we have a dehumidifier down there. And I've just been noticing that stuff I've been making with that flour has been taking like a lot more water. But this seems fine.
Do you have a doomsday supply of flour?
We did. The doomsday being Claire's recipe testing. And
Are you working on a new book or something?
I was working on a new book and now it's done. My dough looks pretty good. It has a nice kind of suppleness to it. It's soft kind of and firm at the same time. So now I'm gonna let it rest because I did all of that kneading. The gluten strands, I've developed them, but they really want to spring back now. So the dough is very elastic and I want it to relax so I can extend it and roll the butter in. So I'm going to do this really clever step that I learned in culinary school where you slash the dough. So right now I have it in a round, and that means that those gluten strands are kind of oriented in this like dome kind of shape. I'm going to cut an X in the dough and then kind of open it up. And this is because I'm going to work this into a rectangle or a square. So that just helps me to kind of reorient that gluten network into more of a square shape. So see how I just kind of opened that up? Now I have the square. So I'm going to wrap this and throw it in the fridge, and it's going to rest for about an hour, and then we'll incorporate the butter block. While it's resting, I'll show you how to form the butter block so that we can laminate it into the dough. This is not a big enough piece of plastic. Oh well.
Oh.
Hold on, I need a connector piece. I like to work with the dough in an even layer as soon as possible because it will just make your life easier down the road. So I could leave it like this, but I'm gonna actually roll over the packet with my rolling pin to try to get it into an even layer. Just the more even it is now, the easier you'll have when you go to roll it out. So this is not like a vast quantity of puff pastry. I scaled everything so that I can use 2 sticks of butter in the block. The idea here is that I'm forming a very thin, very even, and squared off packet of butter. And that is going to then be folded into the dough and rolled out. I am just going to kind of loosely wrap the butter and start to beat it with the rolling pin to work it into a texture that's just like a little more pliable. I don't want it to get warm, but I want it to be pliable. I'm beating it lengthwise so that it kind of widens. And once I have it to about 3/4 of an inch thick, I'm gonna then roll rather than beat. So I'm thinking this is gonna be about a 7-inch square. And you wanna wrap it almost like a present. I'm creating very square corners. That's important. The same principle applies here as applied to the dough. The more sort of precise and careful you can be at this stage, the easier you'll have when it comes to lamination, because lamination is not the easiest technique. And before I fold the last bit, I'm going to turn it over so that I have the folds down, and then that will keep the packet kind of closed as I go to roll. I'm just going to roll over it with the rolling pin in both directions, lengthwise and crosswise, to get it to fill in any gaps in the parchment paper. Then the last fold. I got 7 by a little under 7, that's fine. And now same thing, rolling over it with the pin until it's really flat and I have butter all the way into the 4 corners, making like a sharp right angle. So you can see I'm like angling the pin so that I can roll straight into the corner. And it should fill out very easily. So we have the dough, and I have the butter. I'm gonna let them rest at room temp a little bit because I need the butter to actually soften. So it's really important when you lock in the butter that the dough and the butter are of similar consistencies and textures. Like the firmness should be the same, and then they'll roll out evenly. I have a little bit of bench flour here at my rolling pin, and I'm gonna roll this out so that the width of the dough is about the same as the butter, but that the length is twice as long. So double the length, same width. And the key to any kind of laminated pastry is keeping everything cold throughout. That is how you maintain really good separation between the butter and the dough, and then you'll have the flakiest texture. When you're rolling, a good kind of rule of thumb, especially when you laminate, is you want to use more of like a pushing motion than a pressing. So it's really about kind of pushing the dough away from you to lengthen it. And what I like to do to keep it square is to press the rolling pin straight along one of the edges and then push away. And that prevents that edge from rounding off. But a little bit is kind of inevitable. So you see I do this kind of like slight tugging at the corners, and that is to keep the dough square. The butter feels good. I can bend the butter block and it won't break, but it's not warm. So keeping the parchment in place but just uncovering it, I'm going to use the parchment to place the butter right in the center of the dough. Then peel away the parchment, just like that. And now I'm gonna just fold the dough up and over the butter. and I want it to meet in the center. It doesn't have to overlap a lot, but you just want to be able to pinch the two sides together. You want the dough to adhere to itself. And then I do a little bit of pinching also along the edges. This is our locked in butter. See, there is no exposed butter. It's all encased in the dough. Lift up this packet, dust underneath with a little flour. You need only the littlest amount of flour, and that is just so that the dough kind of glides across the surface. And then I'm rotating it 90 degrees. So you can see how I had that seam horizontal, and now relative to me, that seam is vertical. Now before I roll, I'm going to do that familiar motion that you've seen me do for rolling out pie dough and other kinds of dough, which is kind of a gentle beating of the dough. And that is to help me lengthen everything, to thin it out. I find that it also helps to maintain a square shape. So I'm beating it in a crosswise motion in order to lengthen the entire thing, if that makes sense. And you still want to do this pretty gently. And all I want to do here is lengthen the dough. So again, it's that kind of like pushing away motion rather than pressing down. And I like to flip the dough a few times just to make sure that...
Butter exposed.
Oh, I see butter. That's okay. The butter is not so soft that it's actually oozing out. So I want to roll this out to a thickness of about 1/4 inch, maybe more like 3/8 of an inch. And I want it to be relatively thin. We're going to fold it, so it's not actually that important. But I'm going to cut a really thin line of dough off to straighten it out. Here it's like this side's a little bit higher. So I'm just going to cut off a really narrow strip of dough. Now I'm going to fold it into thirds. So this is the first turn. This is called a simple fold, meaning I'm just doing it in thirds like a letter. So here I took the bottom third and I folded it up to the top third. I'm going to take the top third and fold it down to the middle. So now turning it 90 degrees, you always turn it 90 degrees after a turn. You can see that we now have 3 layers of dough. We have 1, 2, and 3. So we've tripled the layers. And now I'm going to wrap this up again and chill it down. So this is just going to go into the fridge in about 20 minutes. I'm going to repeat that again for a second turn. Same process, I'm going to roll it out and lengthen the dough into a thin and long slab. So I'm going to do that same kind of beating process with the dough. And I even like to keep like a little hand here and a little hand here to make sure all of those layers are fusing together and one isn't like getting longer than the other. I just want to keep them all aligned. You don't want too much flour because you don't want the dough to pick up so much flour that it won't like stick to itself when you go to fold it again. Generally speaking, I want it to be about 3 times longer than it is wide, but the thickness is more important. I want it to be thin, somewhere around like 3/8 of an inch. And then I also want it to be even. That's really important too. If you notice that the dough is springing back stubbornly, if you kind of roll it in the other direction, as in crosswise rather than lengthwise, it tends to go a little more easily that way. And then you can kind of resume lengthwise. Same thing as before. I might trim a little bit, very, very minimal. Then up into the center, third. Then down over top. And then that is our second turn. Now we've taken our 3 layers and tripled them again. So now we have 9. Back in plastic for another rest in the fridge. Dough is gonna rest, the gluten will relax, the butter will firm up, and we will come back and roll it out for our third and final turn. It's time for the third and final turn, but just as a little preview, we're gonna let this rest overnight after I'm finished with the turns and then roll it out in the morning. The dough really benefits from a nice long rest after all the turns, just so that you can get it rolled out to the dimensions and proportions that you want. So for today, that's gonna be the last step, is just that third turn. Just know that the longer you can let it rest in between turns, the better, and definitely keep it chilled. Day 2, we're back with puff pastry. I rolled it out a little bit just to make my life easier today, and now I'm gonna roll out and assemble possibly the greatest food ever invented, pigs in a blanket. It is classic with puff pastry, and I'm very excited to eat them. This big trash baggy thing is called a proofing bag. It's a really handy piece of material. It's great for covering sheet trays or like huge bowls, and it just means you don't have to use plastic wrap. So I recommend them. You can find them at like professional baking websites. It's just basically a big plastic sleeve. That's my little shout out for something reusable rather than single use. The dough is nice and relaxed. So While I wait for that to warm up a little bit, I'll show you everything that I have assembled to make pigs in a blanket. Lined baking sheet, an egg wash. You'll need this for coating the top of the pastry, but also for sealing the pigs in a blanket in their pastry crust. A little flour for rolling out, salt and pepper for sprinkling over top. And then of course the hot dogs. These are a really incredible, actually it's a venison hot dog with cheddar and jalapeno. These were made by a local charcuterie and butcher who does incredible work. This is from venison that my husband harvested. Is that the right word? This is a delicious hot dog. We eat these all the time, and they're gonna make a really, really delicious pig in a blanket. So hot dogs are like always fully cooked. So really you're just warming them through, and we just want the pastry to cook. So I'm gonna cut them into, each one into fourths, and I'm just trimming off the end there. There's little bits of cheddar. It's gonna make a really good pig in a blanket. It's like 1.5 inches, 2 inches. So the idea is that these will be wrapped in pastry, kind of like a little 2-bite hors d'oeuvre. Now with puff pastry or any kind of laminated dough, generally speaking, you don't want to roll it out cold from the fridge because those layers of butter can kind of like fracture and splinter and crack. So letting it come to room temp is a good idea. So this has been resting for probably 5 or 10 minutes. I'm going to start to do that beating motion. So I want to roll this out into a rectangle about, I would say, 1/4 inch thick. So a little thicker because I'm just going to go one time around the pastry. This side I have a little bit of tearing, you can see a little. So I just pat, it's actually rolling out pretty nicely. You can just pat a little flour into any areas. Make sure you're moving the pastry around because you might think like, wow, that rolled out so easily, but it's only at that thickness because of the friction with the surface. And then as soon as you unstick it, it like shrinks back. So you always want to kind of keep it moving. As I slide it along the surface, it's not like shrinking back. So this is the true size. I am going to trim it now to the length of my hot dog pieces. But before I do that, I do want to give it just a little bit of a trim around the 4 sides. So I'm just slicing off like the tiniest strip of dough on all 4 sides to square it off, but also I want to expose those layers. So right now, like all of the edges are sealed because of those folds. And when I cut, I'm creating like a cut surface with all the layers are exposed. You can save these strips and bake them. They're gonna taste great. You could add like a little cinnamon sugar, brush them with some garlic butter, that kind of thing. So I'm gonna cut this into a 3x4 grid, and that will be the right size to sort of wrap around one time my lengths of hot dog with a little bit of overlap so I can seal the pastry to itself. Now I'm gonna take my egg wash and I'm gonna egg wash just one strip of dough along the shorter sides of each rectangle. A little dab along one side. About 3/4 of an inch, 1/2 inch, doesn't really matter. This is because I want the pastry to seal to itself when I wrap the hot dogs. And then I'm gonna use the rest of the egg to egg wash the entire pastry after they're formed. I'm gonna take the hot dog and starting at the un-egg washed end, I'm just gonna wrap the pastry around itself. The idea is that it overlaps right along that egg washed end. And then once you have it sealed, give it like a little pressure. And then that is gonna go on our prepared baking sheet, seam side down. That's really important, seam side down. I'm stretching it a little bit to make sure that the ends meet like that. And then pressure on that seam. There we go. And what's nice about this is the pastry is still cold. It's not getting sticky or like hard to work with. So to finish them off, I have my remaining egg wash plus, I'm just using salt and pepper. You could do any topping, sesame seed, poppy seed, everything spice, dehydrated garlic. You could do crushed mustard seeds, crushed coriander seeds, anything that you would want on top. So take that extra egg wash and give everything a thin coat. This will just give the pastry a really burnished golden color. And when you're making egg wash, I beat the egg really thoroughly so that there's like no little streaks or anything like that. It just makes it easier. Last step is just a little salt and pepper on top. So I'm gonna start with salt. Just a light amount. Actually, this is kind of like a pebbly salt, which I like. It almost looks like a pretzel salt. Same thing, some fresh black pepper, and I go pretty light. Make sure you space them out so that as they puff, you're not getting like, you know, puff into each other. And then they're going into my oven, which is preheated to 400, and they will bake just until the pastry is puffed and golden brown and cooked through. We did have some unfolding of the pastry. So it's more like pigs resting on a blanket than in a blanket, but they look and smell so good. So look at the separation of layers.
Ooh, that's nice.
Thanks. The bottoms are perfectly golden brown, not too done, but definitely very well cooked. They're so slippery. The pigs in a blanket are warm but not hot, so they cooled for a little bit. And I mixed together, in the meantime, a dipping sauce. It has 3 ingredients. Dijon mustard, mayo, it's like 50-50, and then just a little squeeze of honey. So kind of like a creamy honey mustard, but still tangy and spicy, and the perfect thing to eat with these. It's the best thing I've ever made.
Doesn't even get out.
It is deceptively simple. It's like a hot dog wrapped in pastry. But it's about the textures. So it's like the shattering layers on the outside that kind of yield to like a more buttery, slightly doughy in a good way interior, then the casing, then the hot dog, and then like the buttery pastry against that kind of like juicy, savory hot dog is so good. The perfect party food. I love these little 2-bite packages that we made them in. Whether you like ketchup or mustard on your hot dog, this will make everyone happy. And this particular version is like the epitome of pigs in a blanket. So, so good. Thank you for watching. I hope you try making puff pastry at home, whether it's our rough puff episode or the more traditional puff pastry like we made today. Either way, you'll have a really impressive result. It's so delicious. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm eating little scraps off the table.